What happens when faith stops being about love and starts being about control?
High Control Catholic groups are hurting real people, and most people don't even realize how far it's gone.
In this episode, we name the harm and expose the high control Catholicism hiding in plain sight.
Join us now as we investigate the history and impact of high control Catholicism. Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
the show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed,
and the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
and embrace a fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
No topic is off limits, and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go!
Some Catholics dream of a return to a so-called old faith, even if it means harm to anyone who doesn't fit their rigid ideals.
These groups fire gay teachers, promote conversion therapy, and tie Catholic symbols to far-right politics, and they're growing.
We've seen how these high-control movements distort faith and hurt real people, especially queer and marginalized Catholics.
In this episode, we'll uncover where this sectarian impulse comes from, and the surprising ways it shows up today.
We'll also ask, what would it take to break free and imagine something better?
Keep listening. It's more common and more dangerous than you think. So before we get started talking about high control religion, we specifically have to think about the history of high control and religious control within the history of the Catholic Church. For us, that means investigating, as we hear from our guest today, elements of monastic communities and religious orders specifically that have existed and lived as cloistered, separated from society. This past Friday, as you read in our first installation of the High Control Catholic series, St. Mary's, Kansas is a specific example of a community that decided to separate itself out from what it considers the secular United States world. It often conflates this idea of a secular, more public space with left-leaning ideas surrounding affirmation and inclusion of not only LGBTQ plus peoples, but more diverse and affirming roles for women, especially women in leadership within religious communities, as well as more diverse roles outside of mother, wife, and caregiver within the church and within their families. But when we think about this history of cloistered communities, we immediately, as we will get into later in our series, histories like Opus Dei, specific communities that date back throughout the history of the church as incredibly secretive, but also incredibly powerful communities, as we've highlighted before, including organizations like Opus Dei that are being revealed to have been involved in human trafficking, as well as sexual abuse scandals, and much is still unknown about these specific communities. With that being said, there is also a deep history of connecting not only monastic and religious ordered communities to high control religion, but also to regulated forms of labor, as well as the conflation and loss of identity within some of these communities. So when we think about these monastic and religious ordered communities, as we will hear from our guest, it's deeply tied to this idea of a loss of identity. That means disconnection from families, disconnection from passive communication with family members and friends and outside communities. In this specific example that our guest covers in the actual episode today, it's an idea of a separatist Catholic community, a specific single-sex separatist Catholic community. St. Mary's in Kansas is one that exists as a self-sufficient society with various families. So thinking through the idea that gender is a play here, thinking through the idea that race is a play here, as we hear from our guest, and we will hear from from our guest today, the idea that not only does high control religion conflate itself with histories of identity loss, abuse, religious abuse of power, and sectarian impulses, but also contexts of continually perpetuating ideas surrounding racism, white supremacy, Christian nationalism that seek to exclude and homogenize specific communities.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you, Emma, starting this conversation in this way because one of the big issues about talking about this topic is it's difficult to like figure out what the container is because we don't really have like names or ways of referring to this movement, this issue within the Catholic Church. I think often about how our experiences as queer people helped us because with being different because it was a quicker way of realizing, hey, this is like really not lining up. But I think often of the people who are still being harmed by the high control groups but don't have the same like lifeline or way of thinking differently about it.
This series was very much sparked by Max and thinking through is just as we've talked about Catholic nationalism, but also ideas of providing people with the language and framework to understand. It's informed by our own reflection of people's comments on our content, people that share they've never seen someone talk about these things before or had any idea that they were not alone in their experiences. So we're appreciative to our guests, but also to you all for going on this journey with us, for taking and holding space for us to investigate what these things mean for many different people, and for hopefully coming away with a better understanding and language for how to understand and combat what systems of high control religiosity and Catholicism do to all of us, not just queer and trans people.
And especially thinking through how other faith communities actually do have language and systems. And many of us, including myself and our guest today, cited the ex-evangelical movements or the ex-Mormon movements, like hearing people who are on the outside critiquing using the shared tags, or even alongside the hashtag Me Too movement, there was the hashtag Church Too movement, which I think was predominantly used by people again in the Protestant world, but a good example of people had something to look at, and so like to point to, they had a reference point. And so that's just another reason why we feel that's definitely missing in Catholicism, and one thing we're wanting to use as a touch point.
That is incredibly important, Max, because that is the framework that undergirds this entire series, is that many of us had to turn to ex-evangelical content, had to turn to people within Protestant and evangelical communities who had already done this work of deconstructing, who had already found communities that discussed and supported survivors of systemic, both sexual violence, but also community harassment and abuse. So especially for me as someone within purity culture, I first learned what that term was through the ex-evangelical movement. It's how I very, very much came to this work and to understand what my experiences were. But using that term in context of Catholicism is incredibly rare. But one thing we'll do in this series is explore how purity culture is a facet, not just a facet, is a central leg or tenet of how high control religion exists. So thinking through how not only can we claim these terms and situate them not only within Protestantism, but explore how very much ideas of gender, racial, ethnic, and social constructs of exclusion are not only tied to Protestantism, but even older to Catholicism and older Christian frameworks, but also create new words of our own. This is about charting a path where we identify our own experiences and validate those of others. And I also want to highlight, Max, as you said, that just this week, as you read this past Friday, we are going through and creating installations of lived experiences of Catholics and non-Catholics alike who read our Substack and are curious to engage and contribute to this series. So Joan specifically had talked about how she's grateful for this series because it's providing language to an issue that has for a long time remained unnamed.
Yes, exactly. And I really feel that I mean, that is a motivation I know that you and I have talked about a lot. And truly, the work that we do together, you and I, that started with just writing together with the masculinity series on my Substack and then led into this podcast that we're doing now, a lot of that came from the solace and solidarity and comfort that comes from meeting and connecting with somebody who shares your experience. And so that is something that is a big motivation in doing this series. Our goal and our hope here is to provide a place where people who have experienced various levels of high control Catholicism can find community solidarity, can find and start to build out some of that shared language and connect some of these dots. So for me, that looks like, particularly within an American context, I appreciated, Emma, that you kind of zoomed out and did the whole history of the church. But to me, I think it's especially interesting in light of an American context because you can really look at the history of America and trace these sectarian impulse to the present moment and see how different Catholics who are involved in far right political movements have kind of come together to push those things out into the open that have previously kind of been in the shadows. Uh, Sometimes I'm like, it's kind of like the Da Vinci Code, but like IRL a little bit. Like some of those like sneaking around and stuff is like kind of like a little bit true. So it's a very big project, and we definitely want, as Emma said, listener voices. So anybody listening now to this podcast, whatever platform you're on, you should be able to leave a comment of some type if you want to share your experience. Or, like we've referenced our Substack, you can go over there. It's maxwellkuzma.substack.com, and you can send us notes or a message through that platform. But yeah, we really want this to be a longer term project that people can really participate in.
100%. Well said, Max. And also delving a little bit deeper into the history. So, as our guest today will share with us, their specific relative who is involved in this deeply monastic community, who's investigating and still waiting to take final vows into this community. For context, because not everyone is familiar with religious and ordained life, is part of what we'd consider within Christianity an anchorite or an anchorite. So it's someone who, for religious reasons, often withdraws from secular society to lead an intensely prayer-oriented life. In the context of what our guests will say, this life involves prayer, but it also involves a self-sufficient community in which manual labor is conflated with devotion. It's one that in many ways also connects to medieval traditions of public displays of devotion. I know when we think of Opus Dei that we saw in the Da Vinci Code, which itself, Opus Dei was not founded until 1928, we think especially of figures that were involved in flagellation. So traditionally, confraternity of penitents in Spain, Italy, and Portugal that would participate in penitent works as public displays and public veneration and in many ways public purification rituals that persisted. But as anchorites believe, there is a different tradition of isolating from society to achieve that. And that isolation is based on the idea of separating out from the community and shedding identifying factors. This idea of identification, I believe, is also important to mention because just as our guest will talk about, the idea of shedding identity within these communities is also deeply tied to this push against secular societies and the idea of identity-based politics.
Yeah, as a queer person myself, I would say High Control Catholicism has impacted me a lot in terms of like my identity, but also other parts of my life. We're pretty like typical Catholics, I'd say, until maybe when I was in I think about 8th grade. My mom started working at a local Catholic church, a traditional Latin Rite church. And it's grown huge. They have people coming from an hour plus away. But the one who got most involved with it was my brother. He started serving there on the altar, which it's very super traditional. Only boys can serve, and they have to go through special training. He didn't want to miss mass because of his baseball tournaments, which were like on the weekends. And so he ended up devoting all of his time, pretty much on the weekends and all his free time, to being there in that community. It was a very sudden shift. Like before then, I was really close with him, and he was like a very typical teenage boy. And meanwhile, I like am hiding my like sexuality. A big thing for me was he does all of these things at church, and he's so involved there, and it seems to be so important to him. But why doesn't he act like what I know like a Catholic should do? Like there are a lot of things that were said to me and to my younger sister that like deeply disturbed me. And honestly, a lot of these things got worse as he became more involved at the church, calling my sister a very like derogatory term just because of the way she dresses, when it's like, okay, like you should never say that to anyone, and it's your sister and she's 16 years old. I was like trying to understand how I felt about this like new version of Catholicism in my family, because it was a lot different from what I grew up with, which was just like, you know, love your neighbor. A couple years ago, he decided to join a monastery. These like cells, I'm pretty sure they call them, out in the middle of nowhere, in Pennsylvania. Then the letters are also, any letter going in is read by, there's a liaison, I believe is what they call her. So it's read by her, and then like it gets granted access to be like passed on to them. And then I'm pretty sure any letter going out also gets read by her. Practice the traditional Latin Mass there. He sent a letter asking us not to write to him anymore. I can't remember the exact words, but basically like it was like pulling him away from like his path to God. It was just hard to understand how this place where he was going to get closer to God was also taking him away from his family. Another thing I find strange is that they don't necessarily listen to what the Vatican says. She really does not like Pope Francis. She doesn't even call him Pope Francis. She just calls him Francis. They just choose not to listen to him and listen to their own priests instead. I feel like a lot of it's also used to justify political stances. I feel like it's politically very different there than other Catholic churches I've been to, even though like most of the ones in my area are pretty like conservative. I don't know, that one just, it's like a whole other, you know, like the whole like trad wife thing. Those people remind me very much of the women that I see at this church.
Many of these communities are the very same ones who are involved in far-right political views, including ones that conflate LGBTQ plus identity with something that is both harmful with grooming, which we know is very false, but also with something that is inherently or in Catholic. So in the same way, separating from identity views and isolating someone in that same sense is totally, in some ways, counter to our understanding of what Catholicism is. It reminds me of Cenobitic monasticism is a tradition that stresses community life. So this is one specific example where a group of monks will live in community, referred to as a cenobium, which is the example that our guest will provide moving forward, and the emphasis on community life. Even in this specific situation, thinking through our guest's brother, specifically in connecting to these communities, this idea of isolation and stripping identity-based politics not only affected her having a relationship with her brother, but her also having an ability to share parts of herself that were policed by the specific religious order. As we will hear from our guest, the idea that letters back and forth from families members were policed, the idea that at the end of it, letters were stopped because this person elected not to be in contact with their family and the outside world. So the idea of intense great loss in identity and also bodily related politics being something that is inherently policed and viewed as a trigger by these communities. So I think it's interesting and important. And this is to say, we always provide the caveat that not every cloistered or enclosed religious order is in this way. There is a very specific tradition surrounding canon law of enclosed religious communities. This is not to detract from what they do or what kind of spiritual life they provide, but to say that in more recent years, there's been the proliferation or the use of enclosed cloistered life as a way to separate off from an outside secular world that's problematic, and also in a way that promotes insular echo chambers, not only within these communities, but within their wider family circles and traditional Latin Mass parishes, just as we hear from our guest. That I think is important to discuss of how this allows especially harmful views around far right rhetoric and MAGA Catholics to persist.
Absolutely. I think that the isolation component is definitely in the realm of the high control, I guess, playbook, and some of those elements of having somebody review your letters before you're able to receive them. That's something that I also have seen echoed in Opus Dei, that Gareth Gore's book Opus really goes into and illustrates in a really important way. Opus Dei is an organization that, when various accusations like human trafficking and sexual abuse, when these types of allegations come forward, Opus Dei's response is so often to just be like, this is a misrepresentation, or this is somebody just who's disgruntled and who is just attacking us. And that response in and of itself is also an example of a high control group, because healthy organizations will own up to their mistakes. They will take accountability. They will say, we planned this event and we didn't have enough accessibility at this event, and we're going to do better going forward. For an example, like, they are able to identify and own up to what they've done, because ultimately it makes their organization more open, more accessible, better going forward. And so when you see a group that shies away from that, and in fact, like, avoids taking any accountability, it's definitely a red flag. And I guess I'm connecting that idea with the idea of isolation, because it's kind of similar. Like, if you're not willing to, like, take criticism, if you're not willing to, like, engage in a dialogue about what exactly you're doing, like, that is an isolating, cutting off type of posture.
100%. 100%. And it goes to the same way if there is not space within an organization or even outside of it to understand and not necessarily to accept, but to process and acknowledge awareness of external and internal criticism. There isn't a system for holding their institutions and these organizations accountable. To the same sense that I think, especially across the United States, there are many, as we'll hear later in the series, charismatic communities and covenant Catholic communities that are deeply involved and sprung up, especially around the advent of the Second Vatican Council. We will hear a little bit later from someone who actually, in the podcast, from someone who actually grew up within one of these communities. But thinking through that development of these charismatic covenant communities around the same time as the Second Vatican Council, an incredibly intense period of change in the church, that we also see at this time the growth of sectarian and separatist Catholic communities, not only family-based ones like St. Mary's, but also the ones that our guest will describe in this podcast episode, are indicative of major shifts of power in the church and attempts by major players within the church to regain back and remodel within their own image of what Catholicism is, a life and community model.
So incredibly well said, Emma. I love the way that you're able to take that zoomed out look and kind of touch on all of these things that are tying in, because all of what you said is exactly right. We can see throughout time the sectarian impulse, this impulse for this more fundamentalist way of approaching religion, approaching Catholicism, has been here. And what's interesting about the history is seeing how, in different times and in response to different movements, how it then manifests. Because, like, for example, one of the aspects that interests me a lot too today is the role of the internet. And we've talked about this in terms of the way that fundamentalist like Protestant groups and Christian nationalists kind of morphed in and pulled in Catholics through social media. The presentation of roles and aesthetics like trad wives, but also through the masculinity that we've talked about, the manosphere, the masculinity series. There are plenty of examples of videos on Instagram. Sometimes Emma sends them to me of like the Catholic gentleman, and they've got the fedora, and they've got the cigar, and they've got the Chesterton quotes. I knew a few of those in when I was going to school at Franciscan University of Steubenville in my conservative days. In the American context, what particularly interests me is starting with the Puritans as this group that was escaping religious exclusion from England, specifically because they were seen as like so intense and so like radical, and the fact that they are like inherently like doomsdayers essentially is a really interesting starting point. And then looking at the role over time, like particularly as Catholics started to come to America, the Puritans weren't necessarily big fans of Catholics, and they weren't the only ones who were not big fans of Catholics. Like as time went on, we talked in prior episodes about like the KKK burning crosses into the yards of Catholics. So there's been an interesting dynamic, and that also brings in the race element, because like with the Civil War and with like shifting social dynamics, because of now there's all these freed Black people around, it became important for Catholics to figure out how racist or anti-racist to be in order to still get that acceptance of the wider white community, which was again still coming from this Protestant background. So I just think that there's so many different elements, and honestly, I really do believe that our ability to kind of like look at this and zoom out and see how these movements have developed over time can really help us to understand what's going on right now and like place ourselves and kind of challenge this idea that, America, like kind of like this idea that we were taught as kids, America is the great, America is the best, like we've figured it all out. I think it's really important to challenge that, because we can see now how that patriotic impulse can also be used as a way to control, or to control the narrative at the very least. And how that develops into things that actually run counter to what we all should be believing in terms of love your neighbor. Like if we do actually believe love your neighbor and all of the stuff that entails, then we need to challenge some of these counter narratives that are coming that are tied up in nationalism.
And I think what you say, Max, is so incredibly important, because this conversation reminds me of, there was a really important article in US Catholic this past September 2024 by Jen Morrison. And it was predicated on this idea that the Catholic Church has a cult of personality problem. So not necessarily alongside the idea of a cult high control problem in terms of separatist communities, even in terms of sedevacantist communities that we've talked about before, like SSPX. But particularly with the conflation and power grab of especially new converts to the Catholicism religion, Candace Owens, J.D. Vance, people who have specifically strived to weaponize Catholicism and its iconography for the goal of promoting Catholic nationalism. And it's the same when we communicate on Instagram of images of the Virgin Mary wearing a mantle or a veil of the American flag. It's images of a rosary made with red, white, and blue beads. It's images of Christ in the manger, swaddled in the American flag, that serve a very specific objective, just like Owens and Vance's language surrounding Catholicism. For a while, as part of my research in college, had investigated why a number of young Catholic women were kind of rushing back to this chapel veil tradition. And it's not to say that everyone was motivated by the same reason, but in speaking with women across the country who chose to return to the veil, a tradition that was specifically pre-Vatican II. So Vatican II was a response to an ever-changing world. And one of those changes, not only along with switching the Mass from being said in Latin to vernacular language, including English for many in the United States, but not necessarily, was the idea that women also and their role within the church in the wider world was changing. So that included negating and disrupting the idea that women, as a status of their inequality, had to have their heads covered entering a church, whereas men did not. So it's interesting that many women are choosing to return to this tradition. But I also want to highlight that chapel veils aren't the only specific example that we see. A lot of these women that particularly are shifting to chapel veils because of their ideas of gender and sexuality are also deeply devoted to ideas of Marian consecration. So specifically the 33-day total consecration to Jesus through Mary by St. Louis de Montfort. And what's especially problematic about this is that ideas around the chapel veil that specifically reinforce this inequality and difference biologically between men and women, incredibly heteronormative and transphobic in many senses, are also equally problematic in our context to race when it comes to the Marian consecrations. So many people may not know, but St. Louis de Montfort framed the idea of this 33-day consecration around considering himself a slave to Jesus and Mary. So he wore chains on his feet and his arms as a token of his dedication and love to Christ. So it's specifically using symbols like this bracelet, that many women wear after they complete the consecration, sometimes not taking them off, that are specific metal chains worn around their hand as a reminder of their, quote, holy slavery to Christ and Our Lady. So thinking through a lot of the symbolism of these traditions that we use are just as important to unpack and explore moving forward, because they're equally as problematic for histories of race and gender that are bound into them that not everyone understands today. So thinking about what our guest will reference in terms of their brother within this community, their traditions surrounding monastic life and elements of conflating suffering with devotion and manual labor with dedication and holiness that have very dark and very powerful connotations within the history of the church that people need to grapple with before there's a rush into separatist communities like this.
Absolutely. And I also think that basically we're not saying that you can't be drawn to religious imagery and symbols, and we're not saying that you can't enjoy veiling or you can't enjoy candles or Gothic cathedrals or stained glass. We're saying let's talk and think about the implications of certain practices that have either problematic associations, like kind of what you were just talking about with that consecration, or even like tying back to the cult of personality. Let's interrogate, like, are we giving these individual speakers, Catholic speakers, too much authority? Like, if you want to be Catholic, I still think this is one of the funniest parts, is this idea that some of these people, these podcasters, like understand what the real Catholicism is, like better than the Pope. And I'm like, okay, but like at that point, you're not really like being Catholic anymore if you're rejecting the Pope. If you won't even, like our guest said, their parent would only refer to Pope Francis as Francis, or as some podcasters, commentators would only refer to him by his like given name of Jorge Bergoglio. We want to be able to engage in things that are meaningful to us, spiritual rituals and the like, but we want to engage with those things in such a way that not only speak to a more inclusive spirituality, to include humanity, but also actually connect to these higher ideals of what it would actually mean to be a loving person. Like Jesus literally did come to abolish kings. So the idea that there's this goal that we need to institute a Catholic monarchy, for example, is just a little bit suspect, more than a little.
100%. And I specifically want to bring in, when we first introduced this series, we got some really wonderful comments from people about their experiences. So Sheila specifically, who was raised within Catholicism, specifically Regnum Christi, and later Christendom College, shared how her husband's family was deeply involved in the Institute of Christ the King, another Latin Mass order, similar to the one that we hear from our guest today. Sheila says something really important that I think resonates with what you just said, Max, of it's always a head trip to me when I mention any of this stuff, and normal people who aren't dialed in say, quote, but Catholicism isn't like that. It's so much more relaxed. Nobody follows these old teachings, unquote. And I realized they and I were experiencing a very different church.
100%.
In the same way that I 100%. In the same way that I think what you're saying in the pocket of the church that I attended in college, of a number of women adopting these chapel veils, of a number of women who encouraged me to participate in these ideas of Marian consecration without understanding that the chains that they would put on their wrist as a dedication to their consecration to Mary, not saying anything against that framework or that form of devotion, was a specific allusion to enslavement. Was an idea of that's a radically different church, including one that my senior year flipped the altar around so it wouldn't face us, than what many people encounter, including a social justice emphasized church that many people I know on the podcast, but many friends of ours that remain in the church were only exposed to growing up.
And one reason why I personally am, again, wanting to emphasize the American context of all of this is because I think one of the best ways to look at the differences in like to Sheila's point, experiencing very different churches is like you have the global Catholic Church, which again is the whole kind of the whole point. We have the Pope who's way up there, but the Pope is like everybody. It's not just America, which again ties into that whole thing where Trump did his AI Pope meme because he knew he was speaking to a group of people who, along with these images of like a chapel veil as an American flag or Jesus wrapped in American flag, they are conflating their religious belief with nationalism. And to be honest, like whether or not this is Catholic or not, I think it's deeply problematic because it sets up hierarchies and orders of authority, which should not be present in a spiritual life that is focused on discerning and growing your inner growth as a person and the way that you lovingly treat other people. As soon as you enter in and bring in this nationalism component, there's a lot of problems. And to be honest, we can see how those problems have manifested throughout history in many different dangerous ways.
100%. And I also want to bring in Beth commented on this introductory post as well that specifically she had experienced high control Catholicism in the Northeast, specifically in the early 1990s through the early 2000s. So specifically, she had moved to the area for the community that had a household program similar to the one at Franciscan University. Steubenville specifically, I think, has been an impetus for many communities, as we'll explore later in the charismatic and covenant community episode. But she specifically remarks that she wanted to be part of an Orthodox and vibrant faith community and was considering becoming a nun. But, quote, I watched in disbelief as my former community embraced MAGA and Trump was preached from the pulpit. Threats of eternal torture were used if you voted for a Democrat. Having a, quote, properly formed conscience, obedient to the magisterium, unquote, was essential for belonging. In retrospect, I see how selective the community was in what they embraced, specifically church teaching, and what they did not embrace. There is massive enmeshment with the Republican Party, so much so that they don't know where the political beliefs end and Catholicism begins. Very few are willing to speak up about the red flags here, even those who see them. And I think what you say, Max, is that even though it may seem different that we're approaching this. We've had an episode already on Catholic nationalism. It's that we cannot discuss high control Catholicism, specifically present high control Catholicism, because of course, as I mentioned at the start of this episode, it's existed since the entire church has existed. Whole Orthodox communities exist by the consolidation of power and the prioritization of authority. But specifically, we can't talk about present models of high control Catholicism that exist in these insular communities without talking about the present political moment in the United States. Um, High control Catholic communities and far right political systems mutually benefit one another by products of their exclusionary politics and their exclusionary morality. As you
Absolutely
mentioned,
well said.
Max. Thank you. As you mentioned, Max, it ties back to the idea that social purity movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, specifically the same ones that profited off of puritanical modes of social purity, were largely anti Catholic at the time, largely anti papist. But in a surprising twist of events, in the late 1990s and early 2000s to present, we're seeing this consolidation of Catholic power. Again, this conflation of Catholicism and evangelical far right religious and political conservatism that is especially damaging. And communities profit off the idea that specific MAGA politics focus on a disavowal of logic, a disavowal of medical community knowledge, a disavowal of modern understandings of identity politics and people's personal and human dignity. They profit off of systems that seek to separate out and disengage with diverse populations, and profit off systems that seek to homogenize American separatist communities. As we'll hear from our guest today, the idea that the choice to make decisions about bodily autonomy, the choice to make decisions about communication with outsiders of family, the choice to make decisions about access to external communications and external news sources are things that are all boiled down and condensed to whether or not, to very much this idea of like a spiritual battle for the souls of Catholics, but also the soul of a nation. So I think it's especially problematic. And I commend, as we hear on the podcast today, guests who take the time to really speak their truth in the story. As you'll hear throughout this series, we're planning to release stories of lived experience alongside our installations of the series. We're going to refer to people by their first names. In full transparency to the reason that we do this is that high control religion, along with any control communities, religious or not, are communities that wield intense political, religious, and social power. This is not to censor the people that have spoken truth to this. This is only to protect people so they can continue to tell their stories moving forward. People that speak truth to their experiences, speak truth to the feelings of isolation, of loss, of grief, of intense self-doubt and guilt and shame. As we hear from our guest today, they specifically are doing the work to help change and expose these communities for the harm that they cause, but being committed to protecting their safety, not only their physical safety, but emotional safety and the safety of family members who are still part of these communities. That's the framework within which Max and I are doing this work. We hope that you contribute to this series and you remain engaged, but hope that you do so in a way that, just like us, is committed to understanding different perspectives, but also to ethically unpacking power systems that are problematic and insular in a way that, just as we heard, or just as we'll hear from our guests today, are especially dangerous and especially common in the United States.
We know that the diversity of human experience is one of the strengths of human experience. And so when we have situations where people are getting cut off from that or told like not in a consensual way, like it is one thing to actually want to be a hermit and to go and to reflect and spend time alone and choose to separate yourself for the most part from society. But it's another thing to be either, purposefully cut off by an authority figure over you, or to have that cutting off happening in a larger social communal way where groups of people are being turned against each other for these reasons of skin color or sexuality, and then that mobilization of those differences benefiting somebody who has more authority or power or money than you do.
100%. So well said. And it ties to the idea that The danger of the conflation of far-right political frameworks with Catholicism and other religious systems is the idea that reinforces that homogenizing efforts, both social, political, and religious ones, are in some ways moral, are in some ways useful and important, are exactly what fuels ideas of separatist and sectarian communities. The idea of wanting to create a homogenized community that doesn't allow diversity to thrive. It's the same reason that you and I, Max, talk about the idea that we continue to remain within Catholic circles and to advocate for LGBTQ plus people of faith, because queer and trans children will continue to be born into Catholic communities,
Absolutely.
even in St. Mary's, Kansas, even
Yep.
particularly possibly within this community of monks. There will always be people that do not fit or are fighting against. It's not a battle that they construct, it's one that's constructed by a homogenizing political or power figure. Against the idea of being an outsider within an insular community. So, our concern and our impetus for this High Control series is to call out not only the danger of this political conflation and political association with high control Catholicism and far right communities, but also to call out the idea that any form of Catholicism, any form of religious system or religious power authority that seeks to relegate or damage or hurt or cast out members who do not fit an isolated image, or seeks to separate itself with a group that it identifies as more pure, is going to be inherently problematic. It's tied to the same social purist values that are informing far-right political movements in the United States today. And it's the same reason that people will always struggle to exist in high control and high policing religious systems. We're not here to come for like people who are cloistered nuns. We're not here to come for people who want rituals. Those are important. Those are part of a whole ton of spiritual and religious traditions. And that's not the problem. The problem is people who are exploiting power systems, who are exploiting their own privilege in order to enact and exert control and authority over other people. It's the people that, when brought into a monastery influence, choose to use their authority to make sure that a person can't contact their family, changes their name, and literally shreds all elements of their identity. It is a form of interpersonal violence and spiritual abuse.
Yes, yes. And it's really important to also, talk about and be aware of the hypocritical nature too, because so often in the political realm, it's people who are not actually upholding any of the actually like good religious impulses or Catholic Christian impulses. It's like, no, we're actually just going to use this just as an excuse to divide and separate and colonize and make money and exploit. Like, we're not actually doing any of the good stuff, just the bad stuff, to the point where like JD Vance had to literally get a smackdown from the actual literal Pope because he was doing such a bad job of understanding what the priority is when it comes to actual Christian belief, Catholic belief.
In bringing our episode today to a close, I think it fits well, just as Max was saying, with the idea that in the United States here, we just finished Pride Month, but it was a particularly bittersweet moment because at the same time we were celebrating our community, celebrations were particularly reframed this year as protests, because at the same time that we were focused on community care, we also saw the potential for religious parents to opt out of LGBTQ plus stories. We saw the Supreme Court allowing specific states to ban young people's access to life-saving care, to gender-affirming care, in the same way that this past month has been equally devastating to many immigrant communities. So I think yes, even the IRS allowing churches to promote political candidates. So I think more than anything, it's been a particularly devastating year, a particularly devastating Pride Month, because of how we're seeing high control religion, not just Catholicism, existing and exerting its influence over American society. For very much the reason that many people have responded to this series, we are excited to go on this journey with you, because many of us, all of us, to some extent, do not have the language or the framework to understand and express what they've experienced. Many of us, especially queer and trans people who have been part of these communities, can articulate what feelings of isolation and shame and ostracism mean because we've lived them. But that's not necessarily the same for people who do not identify in our communities but are still raised in these really problematic high control situations. High control Catholicism thrives when we stay silent, but naming it is the first step towards change.
These movements don't get to define our faith, our dignity, or our future.
If you've seen these dynamics in your own life, know you're not alone, and there are better ways to be Catholic.
Please feel free to share your story with us. Send it on Substack or in the comments wherever you're listening. And thanks for joining us as we shine a light on what's broken in Catholicism.
And as always, we'll be back next time, because this conversation belongs to all of us, and this isn't the final word. Bye!